Science of the Soul, Theosophy, Therapy, and the Evolution of the UFO Cults. An essay in a series on the history of the idea of extraterrestrial visitation. Secret societies always have esoteric beliefs at their core. In his explanation of Freemasonry, Albert Gallatin Mackey attributes the foundation of his faith to Abbe Dom Pernetti, a Hermetic philosopher, and a disciple to some extent of Jakob Boehme, that prince of mystics. To such a man, the reveries, the visions, and the spiritual speculations of Swedenborg were peculiarly attractive. Benedict Chastanier, another disciple of Swedenborg, brought the new rite of enlightenment, Illuminati, to London. This movement retitled itself later as the Theosophical Society. Charles Sotheron, a member of that society, had belonged to the Order of Illuminated Theosophists for a numerologically significant period of 17 years when he co-founded the Church of Theosophy, serving thereafter as its librarian. A Rosicrucian, as well as a high-level Mason of the Scottish Rite, he was Grand Representative of Great Britain and Ireland to the Supreme Council of the Swedenborgian Rite. His religious beliefs complemented his politics. A journalist and editor by day, by night, Sotheron was a socialist district delegate for the Knights of Labor. A busy man, Sotheron still found time for the ancient and primitive rite of Memphis Misraim, which, of all these esoteric rituals, was, quote, the only rite which taught the idea of re-embodiment, alleging that the souls of virtuous men were liberated from rebirth, while those of the wicked were reborn after a period of punishment. Better known as Egyptian Freemasonry, this sacred mystery held that humans who are, quote, neither wholly good nor wholly bad suffer proportion to their guilt, after which they ascend into heaven to receive a temporal reward for their good actions and then reassume flesh. In other words, the soul could be perfected in heaven and reincarnated as a heavenly being. America, allegedly a Christian nation, had in fact been percolating with interest in faraway religious ideas since its founding. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, who co-founded the Church of Theosophy in New York City in 1875, was a female mystic in a land where women were already receiving spiritual authority. Indeed, Blavatsky immigrated to America on a mission to prove that the spiritualists, an American religious movement, had secret knowledge that outranked the Bible. She had come, she said, from the clouded heights of the mysterious Tibetan plateau, bearing this revelation, which was summed up in the motto of her church. There is no religion higher than truth, pronounced in Sanskrit as Satyat Nasti Paradharma. Blavatsky's revealed truth was a literal, physical heaven, where the ascended masters raised the souls of former humans to the next level of being. They lived on other planets, and sometimes they visited Earth to direct our spiritual evolution. This belief evolved into the very first extraterrestrial contact reports. Today's UFO cults are steeped in theosophy. About half of UFO believers reject any spiritual interpretation for their belief, or else prefer to keep it to themselves, while the other half are often explicitly spiritual. David Grush, lately a congressional witness, has emerged as an outspoken spiritualist believer in extraterrestrial beings. According to Grush, all we have to do if we want world peace is release the alien spacecraft from Area 51. Humanity will be so impressed that our differences will vanish, our wars will end, and a new era of global cooperation will begin as we explore the universe in our new, perfected bodies with a shared spiritual consciousness. It is the theosophical tradition speaking through a veil of science, offering therapy for the modern soul. According to The Masters Revealed, Madame Blavatsky and the Myth of the Great White Lodge, Blavatsky, Sotheran, and artist Albert Leighton Rawson shared a belief in ascended masters that became general to Theosophy. Quote, some relation of Sotheran and Rawson to the masters of Blavatsky is suggested by their involvement with the leading freethinker D.M. Bennett. Rawson's Evolution of Israel's God, and Sotheran's Alessandro de Cagliostro, Impostor or Martyr, were both released as part of the series. Popular history of the French Revolution held de Cagliostro responsible for the so-called Affair of the Necklace, an instance of what we would today call fake news, which contributed to the downfall of the monarchy. In Sotheran's Tale of Transmission, the Count of Saint Germain, a mysterious 18th century celebrity, acted as a sort of John the Baptist to the dead Italian, initiating Cagliostro into the Illuminati order near Frankfurt at a large secret meeting attended by Swedenborg and other notables, according to Sotheran. It was, of course, all nonsense, but it connected the theosophical tradition to the central world event that began the 19th century. Blavatsky and her immediate successors claimed to have met Saint Germain as a reincarnated being and communed with the spirit of Swedenborg. They were working with cultural material that was already a century old. Ascended master beliefs remain a potent force in Theosophy today. Blavatsky and her cohort proposed to know the mind of God. Theosophy, spelled with a lowercase t, is the claim to direct knowledge of God's mind through ecstatic connection, feelings, or communication with spirits. Superior knowledge of God's mind allowed them to resolve the dissonance of disparate beliefs, for they knew the true story of Christianity better than Christians did. American alternative religion indigenized and hybridized a world of religious ideas this way during the 19th century, forming an alchemical mix of Protestant Christian tropes with early feminism and socialism. It was the age of science, so the Theosophists propagated pseudoscience that proved the truth of their beliefs. Famously, they held seances to communicate with spirits, including the ascended masters that Blavatsky called the Lords of the Flame. These Lords of the Flame lived on Venus, where Swedenborg had said humanoid beings also lived. The masters were directing humanity towards perfect unity, according to Theosophy. Why, if Earthlings would simply join their galactic program, we would enjoy a 1,000-year reign of perfect peace on Earth. Latter-day spiritual descendants of Theosophy still believe in this magical formula for a revised Judgment Day and ensuing millennium of peace. Most express some version of it without even knowing its origins as an idea. By the beginning of the 20th century, Emanuel Swedenborg was already being forgotten, for his scientific heaven was too primitive and undemocratic for the young, vibrant, progressive United States. Real science, the factory, and the machine brought rapid technological developments and social changes, so American alternative religion set Swedenborg aside for new sources of inspiration. The 19th century was also the age of global European empires. Historian Maria Carlson links Blavatsky to the Silver Age of Muscovy Empire, a time when fashionable people indulged secret religious ecstasies or radinia. Every educated reader who was not a recluse had at least a nodding acquaintance with Theosophy and spiritualism, Carlson writes. But there was also Rosicrucianism, Freemasonry, Martinism, and of course those more sensational manifestations of popular or boulevard mysticism, tarot, somnambulism, chiromancy, phrenology, mesmerism, astrology, geomancy, and hypnotism. Carlson calls secret doctrine, quote, a contemporary Gnostic gospel of a period when occultism in general and theosophy in particular are everywhere present and are in fact a major determinant in the artistic and cultural course of the Silver Age. Theosophy did not appear at the end of the last century by accident, Carlson writes, but was called into being by the frustration and dissatisfaction of a growing number of thinking people who felt intellectually and spiritually cut adrift, unwilling or unable to choose between the sterility of scientific positivism and the impotence of a diminished church. Theosophy offered a Weltanschauung, or worldview, which ostensibly synthesized science, religion, and philosophy into a coherent source of epistemic meaning. Anti-clerical, anti-orthodox, quote, the creative intelligentsia sought eternal verities wherever it could find them in Russia, and Theosophy promised to satisfy their spiritual hunger. Similar social conditions in the West also created spiritual seekers for Theosophy. Secrecy was the Blavatsky doctrine, and it outlived her. Quote, many individual Theosophists' identities were masked behind code names such as Mars, Ulysses, Heracles, Beatrix, Erato, and Gemini, Olaf Hammer writes. Quote, only the inner circle surrounding Leadbeater knew who was who. A mystery gives a religious leader opportunities for power over the believers. Quote, more prominent members are identified in a list. Thus, Krishnamurti's code name was Alcyone. Annie Besant was known as Heracles, and Charles Leadbeater gave himself the designation Sirius. Given Leadbeater's central role, these claims were increasingly used to buttress power struggles. Those who supported the controversial Leadbeater were recorded as having had important roles in the past, while his opponents were depicted as villains. Charles Webster Leadbeater was indeed controversial for a number of reasons, with substantiated accusations of pedophilia standing out among them. His account of life on other planets is less alarming, but still disturbing. Reading a textbook of Theosophy, we find Leadbeater calmly explaining that a, quote, life wave of a divine chain maintains minimal life on the other planets of our solar system, making them reserve planets to Earth. At the present moment, for example, the life wave of our chain is centered on this Earth. But on the other two physical globes of our chain, Mars and Mercury, life still exists. There is still a population, human, animal, and vegetable, and consequently, when the life wave goes round again to either of those planets, there will be no necessity for the creation of new forms. The old types are already there, and all that will happen will be a sudden, marvelous fecundity, so that the various kingdoms will quickly increase and multiply, and make a rapidly increasing population instead of a stationary one. These claims were not so outrageous in 1912 as they are now. Giovanni Schiaparelli had observed canals on Mars during the opposition of 1877. Percival Lowell proposed that Mars harbored life in 1894. Georges Méliès produced his science fiction film A Trip to the Moon, which depicted a lush world with humanoid inhabitants, in 1902. According to Leadbeater, we Earth humans are in fact descended from egos that formerly lived on the moon. Quote, in the second journey round the 7 globes of the Earth chain, the animal men who had been the most backward of the lunar humanity were leaders of this terrene humanity, the highest of the moon animals making its less developed grades. The same thing went on in the third round of the Earth chain, more and more of the lunar animals attaining individualization and joining the human rank, until in the middle of that round, on this very globe D, which we call the Earth, a higher class of human beings, the second order of moon men, descended into incarnation and at once took the lead. This was the bricolage effect. Leadbeater incorporated contemporary scientific speculation, as well as artistic inspirations from the larger culture, into his spiritual cosmology. Rather than men being from Mars and woman from Venus, however, Leadbeater considered the sexed body a recent development. Quote, the very methods of reproduction of those primitive forms differed from those of humanity today, and far more resembled those which we now find only in much lower types of life, he claims. Man in those early days was androgynous, and a definite separation into sexes took place only about the middle of the third round. From that time onward until now, the shape of man has been steadily evolving along definitely human lines, becoming smaller and more compact than it was, learning to stand upright instead of stooping and crawling, and generally differentiating itself from the animal forms out of which it had been evolved. While this is nonsense, sexual dimorphism is more than 1 billion years older than humanity. Leadbeater was trying to incorporate the emerging sciences of anthropology and archaeology, as well as Darwinian evolutionary theory, into his spiritual prehistory, leaving room for reincarnation. His belief in past lives was rare at the time, but it is mainstream today. Quote, nearly 4 in 10 adults under the age of 50, 38%, believe in reincarnation, compared with 27% of those ages 50 and older. According to the 2021 Pew Research Survey on American Religious Opinion. A mere century ago, reincarnation belief was marginal, Hammer writes. The 2 main bastions of this creed were the Spiritist subculture in France and the membership of the Theosophical Society. If one goes back another century, to the turn of the 19th century, belief in reincarnation was almost unknown in the West. It has thus taken a remarkably short time to transform a truly exotic and esoteric doctrine into a widely accepted religious belief, adopted, if the statistics are at all representative, by millions of people in the West. Leadbeater's reincarnation involves metempsychosis, the rebirth of souls into animal beings on other planets. This was both an application of Eastern mysticism and a modern Christian return to ancient Pythagorean ideas. Building on the esoteric ideas of early moderns, who were themselves inspired by Kabbalah, Immanuel Kant, a contemporary and admirer of Swedenborg, had speculated that humans might be reincarnated on other planets. In his Universal Natural History and Theory of the Heavens, Kant wrote, could the immortal soul stay for the eternity of its future existence on this spot in space, on our Earth, when not even the grave interrupts its life but only changes it? Could it never see the other splendors of creation? Who knows if it is not part of its destiny to know those distant worlds of the cosmos that from far away have piqued its curiosity? to get to know the excellence of its institutions. Perhaps that is why some new spheres are still being created in the planetary system, so that we can find new places to live in the skies when the duration of our time here has reached its end. Who knows? Perhaps the satellites of Jupiter circle around that planet in order to give us light one day. The ideas of reincarnation and inhabited planets were therefore connected at conception in Theosophy. Transmigration of souls was reconceived in a Christian imagination as a way for people who had never heard of Christ to be saved in the afterlife. But Blavatsky struggled to syncretize vastly different spiritual programs. Quote, due to the inherent difficulties in harmonizing historically distinct traditions, her reincarnation doctrine is not free from contradictions, Hammer says, understating the problem. Blavatsky differs from Orthodox Hinduism in that, quote, she claims that there is a unique individuality that incarnates again and again, yet it is the very Silver Age aesthetic which shaped her idea of reincarnation. Quote, essentially, the theosophical view of the transmigration of souls is not so much Oriental or Platonic as a typically 19th century construction, a relic of the progressive era. Despite Blavatsky's reference to the Buddhist doctrine of suffering, theosophical reincarnation is the optimistic story of the progress of the human soul. Social justice religion is as old as the hills. It had once again become very important to the alternative religious scene as the 20th century dawned. Of course, we must also acknowledge, quote, another meta-narrative of the 19th century, the view that humanity is divided into races and peoples with clearly definable properties. A closer look at the purported ancient wisdom religion shows it to be a mythologization of ideas characteristic of late 19th century Europe, Hammer writes. This flaw, as well as the misbehavior of prominent theosophists, would lead to the downfall of Theosophy as a popular religion in the 1930s. Lucky for Blavatsky's spiritual descendants, there were new mysteries in the post-World War II sky, and a new imaginarium of what the people living on other planets were like. 2 centuries after Swedenborg had imagined a galactic program for world peace, a man from Venus with an ascended master name stepped out of a flying saucer to deliver a galactic program for world peace. George Adamski, the Earthling who met Orthon in the desert in 1952, had been a practitioner of, quote, scientific Lamaism and parapsychology during the interwar period. As the first human to claim contact with a physical, spaceship-borne extraterrestrial visitor to Earth, Adamski is a natural subject of controversy. To the skeptic, he is the most consequential fraud since Alessandro de Cagliostro. To the believer, Adamski is at best a complicated prophet, for his fakery and flim-flam have not aged well since his death in 1965. That is a pattern for Theosophy. Science has completely changed its mind many times over about many things since Leadbeater wrote his textbook. Therefore, his scientific pretensions have become dated. Intellectual and artistic fashions have also changed over many seasons since Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine. Every generation of theosophists has refreshed the old bricolage of secret knowledge with new cultural material that again fades with changing times. Like the fins on an automobile that was built in the 1950s, too many narrative details become quaint, out of place, or risible. To make matters worse, there is always creative disagreement among the believers about God or the gods and what is on their mind or minds and who gets to speak for the divine. Wise cult leaders monopolize spiritual authority to avoid schism and maintain control of the collection plate offerings. Blavatsky's death left rival leaders Leadbeater and Annie Besant diverging in opinion. All three of them cited the same source of authority: themselves. Leadbeater, for example, makes his claims based on clairvoyance. Austrian Rudolf Steiner claimed to have spiritual sensations. Quote, where Leadbeater merely assured his readers that he knew the difference between observation and imagination, Steiner presents extremely detailed arguments as to why we should believe him, Hammer explains. Everything he writes of, from the climate on Atlantis to the role of the Archangel Michael in history to the mechanisms of reincarnation, builds on the foundations of an alternative science, objective visions achieved through the use of spiritual sense organs. He could tell, for example, that Muawiyah, founder of the Umayyad dynasty, had reincarnated as Woodrow Wilson. That sort of detail was a product of Orientalism, and the esoteric discourse of Theosophists reflected the sweeping generalizations of Eurocentric thinking about the Orient. Egypt, India, China, and Tibet were all a monolithic Orient to Americans. Quote, in the process, certain notions, such as the Oriental Kabbalah, were transformed into a part of Western esotericism. And it is important to note that this was the outcome of polemical identity formations. A polite way of saying that Theosophists argued and split over these questions, many of which derived from anti-Semitism. To resolve their cognitive dissonance, Blavatsky and other Theosophists had detached the Kabbalah from Judaism and established an antagonism between the degenerated Israelites and the Aryans in their imaginary history of the world, Kramer writes. In search of evidence that would buttress her authority against her critics within Theosophy, Blavatsky left the United States for India with Henry Steele Olcott in 1880. She arrived knowing more about Buddhism than the Buddhists, and soon explained Hinduism to Hindus, for her truth was higher than either religion. It was to be her undoing. Quote, Theosophists such as Anna Kingsford, 1846 to 1888, and Edward Maitland, 1824 to 1897, began to voice their protest against the Oriental tendencies of the society, which, among other internal and external quarrels, forced Blavatsky and Olcott to travel back to Europe in February 1884. One pressing issue revolved around the claim that Blavatsky received orders from unseen masters, the so-called Mahatmas, who were regarded as the guardians of supreme esoteric knowledge. The identity and influence of these masters became increasingly subject to scrutiny, which opened another front in India and forced Blavatsky and Olcott to return in October 1884 to face accusations of fraud. The affair took a devastating end when Richard Hodgson, a member of the Society for Psychical Research, who was commissioned to write a report on the matter, concluded that the Mahatma letters, as well as the phenomena produced by Blavatsky, were forgeries. On March 31st, 1885, Blavatsky left India forever, while Olcott remained as president of the Society. The Theosophical Society disputes the findings of Hodgson to this day, but India proved to be a trap for other Theosophists as well. Besant and Leadbeater endorsed a local child prodigy, Jiddu Krishnamurti, as the reincarnated Christ, only to see him turn away from their teaching and shut down the Order of the Star in the East, which had been prepared for his godhood in 1929. It was the beginning of a broad downturn for the new religion. Since the 1930s, the majority of theosophical groups have experienced a decline in membership and influence, Kramer says. Today, avowed theosophists of the Blavatsky Church number in the mere tens of thousands worldwide. Still, The intellectual impact of Theosophy on Asian nationalism has been profound. Mahatma Gandhi took a large measure of inspiration from Theosophy, which also inspired nationalist movements in Burma and Tamil Sri Lanka. Through the work of Theosophists, Balinese religion was legitimated as Hinduism. Indian Neo-Hinduism is still, quote, deeply entangled with Theosophy. What began as Orientalism became Pan-Asianism, as the transgression of cultural boundaries became a transgression of geographical and scientific boundaries. Germany was another scene of fervent theosophical innovation and boundary transgression. As the Blavatsky Church disintegrated on the subcontinent, Steiner founded Anthroposophy, a re-Christianized theosophy that mixed well with other German cultural materials, most notably Ariosophy, the new religion that believed Germans were the descendants of ancient Aryans. So-called border sciences were high academic fashion in Germany. German myths and folktales formed a bricolage with occult ideas, quote, ranging from astrology, parapsychology, and radiesthesia, dowsing, to world ice theory, Eric Carlander writes. Scientific understanding of the true age of the Earth and the geology of glacial ice was still in its infancy. Quote, in its attempt to unite spirituality and science, Anthroposophy made a nominally greater effort than Theosophy to validate its doctrine empirically. In conducting aura research, for example, Steiner modeled his experiments on the new techniques of X-rays and the microscope. Nevertheless, his insistence on having proven occult phenomena for which there was no empirical evidence prevented Anthroposophy from being accepted within the scientific community. That only changed in the 1930s when the Third Reich began officially sponsoring elements of Steiner's doctrines, most notably biodynamic agriculture. Quote, Anthroposophy was at least as much a religious faith as it was a scientific doctrine, Kurlander notes. Steiner's teachings and articles published in his occult journal, Lucifer Gnosis, anticipated the Nazis' own interest in Asian religion, Gnosticism, and Luciferianism. Christianity alone could not have shaped the Nazis. Quote, the lure of Theosophy and Anthroposophy, like many occult doctrines that emerged at the turn of the 20th century, was precisely their convoluted attempt to find new syntheses of what they termed knowledge, Wissen, and belief, Glaube, propagating absurd, border scientific racial theories and an eschatological vision of humanity's history and future, Kurlander writes. While only marginally successful before the First World War, these efforts inspired a range of theories on race and space related to the concept of Lebensraum. The re-enchanted sciences thus informed the Völkisch religion of the Nazis as objective sciences. Germans, frustrated with Christianity, turned to alternative religion by the end of the 19th century, leaving fertile ground for Theosophy. Wilhelm Huberschleiden, quote, advocated Theosophy as a counterpoise to the self-decomposition of the traditional Christian churches on the one hand, and the sensuous materialism and thoughtless pleasure hunting, the moral and spiritual decay of modern life on the other, Kurlander explains. Theosophy might provide the basis for a new, less fragmented, more integrated individual, a view of social reform that began with the spirit and not the material conflicts between social classes. As the editor of the theosophical journal Sphinx, Huberschleiden tried very hard to establish some sort of scientific basis for his spiritual knowledge. Like Blavatsky, he had received the teachings of a powerful Mahatma in the form of a mysterious letter, he said. Oberschleiden filled his apartment with elaborate wire contraptions meant to represent chains of molecules, reflecting the transcendent experience of Theosophy. Kurlander writes that he represented the peculiar mix of cosmopolitan and racist, scientific and esoteric elements that characterized the Austro-German supernatural imaginary. One testament to the malleability and eclecticism of these closely related doctrines is that by the eve of the First World War, many leading Austro-German theosophists, including the president of the Austrian Theosophists and the entire chapter of the Vienna Theosophical Society, had joined the vehemently racist and anti-Semitic List Society. Guido von List was father to Wotanism, a reimagined Norse paganism that probably bore closer relation to Richard Wagner's operas than actual ancient German religion. Engaging in his own theosophy, List also incorporated elements of Masonic Templar, Freemason, and Rosicrucian traditions in his new religion. Quote, both the Theosophists and Anthroposophists were preoccupied with bringing the Aryan sixth root race of Blavatsky and Leadbeater back into existence, Kurlander writes. Both believed, at least in their Austro-German iterations, that Aryans were superior spiritually and biologically to Jews, Asians, and Africans. Steiner himself avowed that by separating another kingdom of nature, the kingdom of the evil race, humanity was throwing out the lower forms in order to purify itself. Anthroposophists embraced eugenics, not primarily because of their faith in modern science then, but because they thought that spirituality and race were intrinsically linked. Steiner actually argued that darker skin resulted from demonic influence. The implication was that genocide, Nazi hygiene, was a progressive way to improve the human race. The so-called Welteslehre, or world ice theory, became quite popular among German neo-pagans during the 1920s as a virtual cult grew up around Austrian scientist and philosopher Hans Horbiger. They saw his glacial cosmogony, literally glacial cosmology, as, quote, scientific proof of their fantastic cosmologies and spectacular worldviews, Kurlander writes. In this Ur-Germanic alternative to Jewish physics and soulless natural science, the cataclysmic floods, apocalyptic battles, and heroic Aryan civilization of the Edda appeared to be confirmed, animating beliefs that were both utopian and pessimistic at the same time, paving an esoteric Autobahn that led to the Gotterdammerung of World War II. Quote, despite attacks by state officials, liberals, even conservative religious groups, occultism and border science continued to grow in popularity, becoming not only an upstart religion, but also an upstart science, Kurlander says. List was still popular with the German middle and upper class when he died in 1919. Wotanism had promised that the First World War would establish a global German empire. While this prophecy had failed, it still had a measure of appeal that lasted after Versailles. Adolf Hitler's motivation for using occult symbols and scripts was likely calculated and performative, a way to appeal to his audience. Hitler did not hide these influences after he entered politics either, Kurlander writes. Indeed, he borrowed a symbol from Theosophy as the logo for his party. Quote, in February 1920, he gave a speech that relied openly on Volkisch writers such as Guido von List and Theodor Fritsch.
He began with a gloss on Liszt, arguing that the Aryan, during the Ice Age, engaged in building his spiritual and bodily strength in the hard fight with nature, arising quite differently than other races who lived without struggle in the midst of a bountiful world. We know that all of these people held one sign in common, the symbol of the sun. All of their cults were built on light, and you can find this symbol, the means of the generation of fire, the quirl, the cross. You can find this cross as a swastika, not only here, but also exactly the same carved into temple posts in India and Japan. It is the swastika of the community once founded by Aryan culture. When the smoke of the mushroom clouds cleared after World War II, the swastika, a key 19th century symbol of Theosophy's fusion of Eastern and Western traditions, was no longer acceptable in polite society. Interest in esoteric religion was at its lowest ebb in Europe since the early modern period. A series of scandals, Leadbeater's pederasty, Aleister Crowley's public excesses, the fraud trial of Edna Ballard, had damaged the credibility of occult religion. Stories about the Comte de Saint Germain visiting from Venus to convey the instructions of the Lords of the Flame were no longer taken seriously. Lucky for Theosophists, America is a land of reinvention where a new sucker is born every minute.
Hammer explains that belief in reincarnation appealed to the consumer model of a la carte religion. Leadbeater was instrumental in the move toward personalized reincarnation legends, the democratization of spiritual authority to know one's own past lives. Quote, his claims to precise knowledge of past lives resulted in the elaboration of long lists in which members of the society were traced back, sometimes hundreds of thousands of years. While retaining the mythology of reincarnation, Leadbeater and Steiner created a large set of personalized legends concerning the past lives of prominent people, based on their own positions as recipients of privileged experience. They could remember your past lives for you, retail. In the United States, Edgar Cayce had similar claims to revelatory insight, but democratized this status yet another step by making esoteric knowledge available to anybody who enlisted his services. Depression-era Americans were eager to hear how rich and powerful they had once been as someone else. Quote, by projecting the lives of his clients back through the eons, Cayce gave them material for an imaginary autobiography in which details of the here and now could be explained. By the time he died in 1945, Cayce decisively transformed privileged experience into personal experience, leading to the present state in which anyone can discover their own past lives with the help of a book or a TikTok video. Quote, ordinary careers as a housewife or employee were enriched with new dimensions of meaning by being linked with Atlantis or ancient Egypt. Problems in the present could be explained by referring to unpropitious destinies hundreds of years earlier. Belief in reincarnation is far more common in America today than committed theosophy. According to Olaf Hammer, this is because the psychotherapeutic profession took over as the new priesthood of reincarnation. Maury Bernstein, a self-taught hypnotist from Denver, was deeply fascinated with esoteric beliefs in general and Cayce's readings in particular. During age regression sessions with a highly suggestible subject in November 1952, at almost the same time that George Adamski met Orthon from Venus, Bernstein gave his client, Virginia Tighe, the suggestion to go back further and further in memory until she reached scenes other than those she had experienced herself. Quote, Tighe duly reported that her name was Friday Murphy and that she lived in Cork, Ireland. Over the course of 6 sessions, Tighe revealed what seemed to be memories of a previous life in Ireland. The Colorado housewife spoke with an Irish brogue, told Bernstein what her home on the periphery of Cork looked like, and revealed details of her family. Bernstein wrote 3 articles in the Denver Post recounting the details of the strange case. Agents for Doubleday, a major American publisher, read the story. Published in 1956, The Search for Bridie Murphy was translated into several European languages and made into a Hollywood film. It spawned many imitators in what we now understand as a process of social contagion. People learned about hypnotic regression, then sought therapists willing to help them remember past lives, then told their friends about it. Many therapists began as skeptics, only to be converted by their clients. Hammer writes that many of the new movement texts portray a therapist who begins by embracing the more orthodox theory, only to embrace purported past life memories as a new line of business. As seen in the example of Virginia Tighe, however, subjects can be induced to invent fictitious memories under hypnosis. False memories of the past often sublimate real issues in the present. Quote, the fact that a subject is obese can, with some cueing from the hypnotist and an appropriate frame of interpretation, give rise to fantasy images of a past existence lived under dire circumstances, Hammer explains. These fantasies can then be integrated into a partially imaginary life history as an explanation of, and perhaps an excuse for, one's present overeating. Then maybe the patient feels better, but the idea that past life traumas cause the present suffering reverses the chain of cause and effect. The therapist who tells a client under hypnosis to go deeper is in fact telling them to use their imagination. This pattern repeats in the story of Betty and Barney Hill, history's very first alien abductees. The Hills saw something strange, wondered if they might remember more about it under hypnosis, and sought the help of Dr. Benjamin Simons. A skeptic, Simons was only concerned that they should feel better after his sessions. He did not care about the realness of the flying saucer or the aliens on board it. The Hills' spiritual biography as a couple began in a politically and theologically progressive, yet entirely respectable and conventional Unitarian congregation in their home in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Matthew Bowman writes. At the time, their denomination insisted that science policy as a way of generating national knowledge should not be restricted to cloistered experts, but open to democratic discussion. Betty's family was marked by union organizing and heterodoxy in religious faith, joined with a streak of utopianism and an interest in reform and a dash of confidence. Barney had begun as a passionate Episcopalian in the world of civil rights and respectable integrationism, the program to advance Black Americans through a strong Black middle class. When they resettled in Portsmouth, they were happily unchurched for a while until they met John Popendreau, an acolyte of pacifist Unitarian minister John Hayes Holmes. Popendreau was a crucial connection for the Hills, promoting their story to the extent they considered him a UFO believer. Their interracial marriage had begun without a honeymoon. 3 months after meeting Papadro, Barney took a few days off from his post office job and Betty from her social work to drive to Niagara Falls and Montreal. Quote, they were also, like many Americans at the time, aware of and a bit ambivalent about the concept of flying saucers, the language of the time for strange things Americans were seeing in the sky. Barney told Betty immediately after the sighting that he still did not believe in flying saucers. Bowman identifies the Hills as adherents to the New Deal coalition, characterized by trust in government, who turned against their government, indeed, all governments, during the decade that Americans stopped trusting their government. Disillusioned when the United States government took no interest in their story, the Hills, quote, joined the loose network of esoteric practitioners affiliated with what is often called the New Age, and they increasingly embraced conspiracy theory. Betty ended her days distrustful of scientific analysis and obsessed with mysterious black helicopters she saw in the skies. Technological progress became disempowering, a tool of oppression in the eyes of the Hills. By closely examining the shifting patterns of the Hills' story, how they told and retold the story as their contexts and experiences and even memories changed, Bowman shows how their beliefs about their world and the power they had in it changed as well. Upon their encounter in 1961, Barney believed then in racial uplift. 3 years later, after remembering under hypnosis that small human-like beings had kidnapped them and subjected them to medical experimentation on board the spaceship, Barney was losing trust in the government. This abduction story, which came from Betty's nightmares and which they repeated to anyone who would listen, bore striking resemblance to scary encounters in the social justice struggle taking place in Mississippi, but at the safe remove of New Hampshire. It was Betty who insisted on calling Pease Air Force Base to report the initial sighting and who consulted the 1955 book, The Flying Saucer Conspiracy by Donald Kehoe for answers when the Air Force offered none. Kehoe, who had previously written fiction about World War I flying aces with psychic powers, had already published The Flying Saucers Are Real in 1950. The earlier book reads like fiction, Bowman writes. It is written from a first-person perspective, with Kehoe himself as one of the heroes investigating the shadowy nooks of the Air Force, the reader encountering evidence not of mathematics or probabilities, but of individual testimony, and Kehoe as a reliable witness. Kehoe's conclusions, that aliens had been observing the Earth for 2 centuries or more, and that the government feared panic whenever this secret truth was revealed, are still foundational beliefs of contemporary UFO believers. Having read The Flying Saucer Conspiracy, Betty wrote to Kehoe describing the encounter, but adding a new incident. Just south of Franconia Notch, in the vicinity of Indian Head, a small resort near a large rock formation, the couple stopped in their car and got out to observe the object in the sky more closely with our binoculars. Quote, we did not report my husband's observation of the interior, as it seems too fantastic to be true, Betty told Kehoe. She said that Barney had gone into a hysterical condition, laughing and repeating that they were going to capture us. By her own admission, this dreamlike sequence, in fact, emerged through her dreams. She was likely a highly suggestible subject under hypnosis, just like Virginia Tighe. The Hills believed in psychology's power, Bowman writes. Barney Hill echoed Earl Warren's arguments about the link between psychology and racism in speeches he gave against segregation that referenced the landmark 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision. Showing their faith in the field, Betty and Barney agreed to receive couples counseling before their marriage. Betty told Kehoe that she wanted to see a competent psychiatrist about the flying saucer encounter. Quote, but the language the Hills used to describe their experience with psychiatrists, as they sought to figure out what had happened to them, reflected ideas about the discipline more prevalent among other Unitarians than among Freudian practitioners. Unitarian psychology rejected Freud's unconscious for rationality and replaced mind mechanisms with a science of the soul. In her Dreams or Recall document, Betty's first written account of the close encounter, she, quote, uses the language of psychology throughout. Altered states of consciousness, trauma, and forgetting, Bowman observes. In this account, 11 aliens confronted the Hills as the car suddenly died. Carrying Betty into the spaceship, the aliens examined her, taking biological samples of hair, skin scrapes, and fingernail clippings. Then, in a scene that was to be repeated in countless alien abduction narratives, the creatures shoved a 4 to 6 inch needle into her navel. The alien leader told Betty that this painful procedure was a pregnancy test. Then he erased her memory. Quote, while a Freudian might have read Betty's dream for its symbolic nature, Betty instead read it as straightforward recall that had given her a mission and a purpose, Bowman writes. Whereas Barney's story was filled with fear, Betty's was marked with fascination instead of fear. Barney's racial anxiety surfaced in his description of aliens as, for example, a red-headed Irishman, a character stereotype which he associated with unfriendly attitudes towards Negroes, while the leader appeared to be, quote, like a German Nazi in his black scarf, visored hat, and jacket. Quote, he is a Nazi. They were telepathic, speaking to Barney with their eyes. In another scene that would be repeated by innumerable alien abductees, the aliens inserted a cigar-sized tube into his anus. The hypnotizzy of the Bridie Murphy story had popularized hypnotic regression, democratizing its practice beyond professional boundaries. Ufology was following a similar trajectory. Belief in the link between buried traumatic memories and present psychological symptoms, with or without reincarnation, grew throughout the 1960s, when the reputation of hypnosis was peaking. By the end of the 1970s, so-called recovered memory syndrome and the satanic panic repeated this pattern, again with therapists participating, some as skeptics, others as believers. Like most Americans at the time, the Hills misunderstood hypnosis to be a perfected science, when altered states of consciousness were barely understood at all. Quote, Barney Hill described hypnosis functioning with the precision of a machine, Bowman notes. The Hills thought hypnosis enabled perfect memory. Experts already disagreed. But the Hills' faith in scientific rationality to confirm their spiritual beliefs was stronger than any expert opinion. Dr. Simon, for example, concluded that the Hills suffered from cryptomnesia, the confabulation of memories. Simon preferred to describe hypnosis as an expression of the therapist's ability to manage his patients, Bowman writes. He stressed his aim was not recovery of memory, but the relief of anxiety from his very first appointment with the Hills. He thought the couple, quote, were unconsciously trying to deny a very terrifying experience. Not perhaps an alien abduction, but the regular pressures of a tense moment in their marriage, lost on a strange road, squabbling, haunted by potential threats. Reports like theirs were almost routine in his office, Dr. Simon told a journalist later. He was less interested in what they encountered than in their emotional relationship to the experience. Simon hypnotized both subjects easily, Barney more easily than Betty. He began assuming that Barney had confabulated the story, but soon decided that he was in fact the more suggestible of the two, and that the story had emerged from Betty's dreamscape. While he believed the Hills had seen something, he was convinced that the abduction and examination memories were false. But his efforts to convince the Hills of the falseness of their experiences actually hardened their belief. They decided that their recovered memories were real, and that official disinterest in them was suspicious, if not evidence of a cover-up. Their view tracked with Donald Keyhoe, who warned that the CIA had taken control of the UFO investigation in 1960. And by the end of the decade, he was writing glumly that the CIA agents ran the whole show, and the scientists followed their lead. Keyhoe became one of the writers who amplified the theme of government conspiracy in his coverage of the Hills. Like Dr. Simon, the federal government increasingly regarded flying saucers as the product of psychological disturbance rather than the Soviets or extraterrestrials. Reactions to their story pointed to psychological explanations. Despite their best efforts, the Hills stories surfaced in the press in 1965. They were the very embodiment of decent Americans, Bowman writes. But their story seemed irrational, and for many Americans, their interracial marriage seemed irrational too. Barney felt the loss of respectability more keenly than Betty. As a result, Barney's hopes for racial reconciliation took a beating. Television lights were harsh. Panels of experts were skeptical, and many journalists were cynical. Quote, but the more sympathetic they were, the harder it was for them to understand why the Hills believed as they did. What the Hills actually believed was also changing. Quote, their waning faith in the American establishment sent them on a quest for other sources of explanation and validation, one they felt took seriously their experiences and beliefs. Not long after their sessions with Dr. Simon ended, the Hills met a practitioner of remote viewing at a dinner party. It was not long before they were meeting channelers and automatic writers who were in regular touch with extraterrestrial beings. They became spiritual seekers, just as American alternative religion experienced a renaissance. Their new interest in esoteric belief drew the Hills towards a fringe that was already turning paranoid. Quote, conspiracy theory grew among those who either rejected conventional politics, like many white advocates of the New Age, or those whom it failed, like Black Americans. And many UFO believers, as they felt rejected by the establishment, like the Hills did, embraced this alternative, Bowman writes. Betty's interest in occult beliefs and parapsychology deepened after Barney's sudden death from a stroke in 1969. Her story was still changing. During a 1974 session with a medium, for example, Barney's spirit reportedly confirmed for Betty a newly popular idea among UFO believers that the aliens were kidnapping humans for breeding experiments. Quote, their complexions were of a gray tone, like a gray paint with a black base. Their lips were of a bluish tint. Hair and eyes were very dark, possibly black, Betty described the aliens at first. They wore uniforms. Under hypnosis, however, quote, they were out of proportion. They were short. They had a larger chest cavity structure. They were maybe broader than we are through their shoulders. As her memory of the aliens' bodies changed, the new image, quote, helped Betty order their presence in her egalitarian universalist universe, Bowman writes. In 1961, the aliens had prominent noses, quote, larger than the average size, like Jimmy Durante's. In 1964, however, she described the aliens as Mongolian or mongoloid in appearance with a small nose. Then in 1966, she declared that they had practically no nose at all, just mere nostril slits. By the time the couple worked with an artist in 1967, quote, Betty had begun to think of these creatures as the product of the same evolutionary process that produced human beings, different less in kind than in degree. She was inventing the modern greys. Steven Spielberg used similar aliens, without irises or pupils, in his 1977 film Close Encounters of the Third Kind, cementing the archetype of the alien visitor abductor in the public mind. Annie Besant had coined the term New Age in the 1920s, and by the 1970s, this label was subsuming the entire alternative religious scene, not just in America, but around the world. Psychotherapy considered itself a science, yet psychotherapists often took inspiration from spirituality. Psychotherapy considered itself a science, yet psychotherapists often took inspiration from spirituality. Therapy and the New Age were not discrete phenomena, but often worked hand in hand. Quote, It is not presumption which drives me to write about UFOs, Carl Jung wrote in 1958, but my conscience as a psychiatrist that bids me fulfill my duty and prepare those few who will hear me for coming events which are in accord with the end of an era. A keen student of alternative religion and the occult, Jung was announcing the imminent age of Aquarius and the, quote, possible psychic consequences of this foreseeable astrological change. The contradictory nature of the UFO phenomenon proved to him that, quote, conscious and unconscious fantasies were giving rise to speculative conjectures and pure fabrications, with the latter supplying the mythological background inseparable from these provocative observations. UFO reports were psychic products. Their apparent weightlessness, a violation of physics that marked them as non-physical, a living myth, italics original. The psyche represents the only opposite of gravity known to us. It is anti-gravity in the truest sense of the word, evoking ancient alchemy, Hermetic philosophy, and interpreting dreams and art. Jung saw the flying saucers as archetypes of the gods, putting quotes around the word to emphasize the symbolism rather than any sectarian idea. People all over the world were projecting symbols from deep within their psyches onto the skies, Jung said. If the flying objects were real, and they might be, then they must be triggering these psychic projections to usher in the new age. Jung died in 1961. Jacques Vallée, a French-born writer, met the Hills and expanded on Jung's concept of the flying saucer as a spiritual rather than physical reality in his 1969 book, Passport to Magonia, From Folklore to Flying Saucers. Citing dozens of UFO reports, alchemists, Hermetic philosophers, and various urban legends of supernatural experiences, Vallée tried to strike the same balance between UFO as consciousness and flying saucer literalism. Quote, if the phenomena are to be ascribed to psychological causes, then the causes must have manifested themselves during all epochs, Vallée writes. On the other hand, if the phenomenon is not wholly psychological in nature, then the discovery of historical antecedents would be a valuable clue to its nature. Vallée inspired the scientist character Claude Lacombe in Close Encounters, played by Francois Truffaut, a scientist who remains open minded while listening to Richard Dreyfuss describe his spiritual experience with the cinematic aliens. Vallée saw UFO reports as both folklore in the making and a matter for serious scientists. Quote, "There is no such thing as a scientific problem. It is the man who looks at the problem who is scientific in his approach or who is not. But as the Hills demonstrated, the word scientific is contested terrain. And as Vallée's book demonstrates with numerous examples, extraterrestrial encounters imitated science fiction more often than science. As the psychotherapeutic professions told the UFO witness, contactee, or abductee that it was really all in their head, or even in their soul, the popular culture encouraged a contrary literalist belief in physical aliens from outer space. These are still the two main ideas within ufology, and the primary source of tensions within that community. A century after Blavatsky formed the Church of Theosophy out of ancient esoteric religious ideas, those same ideas were identified with the New Age, and the once secret doctrines of small t Theosophy had become popular literature. Olav Hammer notes that even today, the alternative religious scene is infused with recognizable remnants of Blavatsky's bricolage. Quote, regardless of which entities are said to be the source of revealed wisdom. Archangels, Egyptian priests, ascended masters, dolphins, or extraterrestrial beings from the Pleiades, they all seem to have adopted turn of the century theosophical doctrines of the steady progress of the soul through successive lives. However, the New Age had mediums trained in the new soft science of psychology and later postmodernism. Quote, therapies and do it yourself projects display one of the key characteristics of a discourse in the Foucauldian sense of the word, to protect the boundaries of a given set of doctrines, and by defining who has acceptable opinions, to limit the authority to speak to those who accept the fundamental tenets of the discourse, Hammer writes. Dissenting voices that present such experimental research are, for obvious reasons, never allowed to speak out in the esoteric texts. Doubt is a sin. Nor has the priesthood given up its power. The late Harvard psychiatrist John Mack was just one prominent example of the new alien abduction priesthood. Laurie MacDonald is still treating alien abductees in Sacramento. A simple Google search turns up active hypnotherapists still soliciting abductees on the internet. They are giving the people what they want, leading them towards their preferred conclusions. Herein lies a deep contradiction within New Age religiosity, Hammer writes. Overtly, its texts commonly invoke a democratic ideal, according to which nothing needs to be taken on faith, and which insists that the reader's spiritual experiences are by far more important than any opinions that the author might entertain. These experiences, however, are molded by the expectations of the most influential spokespersons of the movement. It might even be argued that earlier forms of authority, depending on claims to clairvoyance or contact with spiritual masters from Tibet, were easier to see through than the subtler strategies of the last few decades. Today, Emanuel Swedenborg is utterly forgotten, and his influence on 19th century American religion, as well as his description of life on other planets, are not common knowledge. Few people today are really familiar with the work of Helena Blavatsky or her contemporaries, or her spiritual heirs such as Guy and Edna Ballard, who popularized Christian theosophy in the Depression-era United States, or George Adamski, who met an alien from Venus in the desert in 1952. Many people know who Betty and Barney Hill were, but they are less familiar with the couple's turn away from mainstream religion, or Betty's embrace of the New Age, than their uncanny interlude in The Flying Saucer. Cable television shows leave out the religious origins of belief in extraterrestrial beings, even as they proselytize us with theosophical programming about ancient aliens. The more scientific UFO believers are, the more their beliefs resemble science fiction. Displays of spiritual fervor still emerge from the community, however, because disclosure has become the new prophetic discourse. All those people who believed so strongly for so long that the government was hiding evidence that aliens exist cannot possibly be wrong. Decades of belief outweigh any evidence or lack of evidence for the belief. After all, the government lied about JFK and Vietnam, so how can we trust them? They told us it was all in our heads that we were seeing things. Surely they were hiding something. Whatever it is, the secret knowledge must be world-changing, a real threat to the man and the system. Otherwise, they would let us see it. The disclosure cult is projecting their belief system onto the government, of course. Their beliefs began as secret knowledge, and to secrecy they must return. Thank you for listening to this audio essay. Learn more about this topic with a premium subscription to osborneinc.com.